So, welcome. This is the first of two conversations between Sorrel and I, Sorrel Pinder and me, John Britton. Two conversations as part of the School of Humankind's free community events program. Sorrel and I met a couple of years ago online. We've never actually met in person, but we met online a couple of years ago. One day, who can tell? And we talked about many things, but it gradually emerged that one of the things that is, of significance in both our lives is the fact that we were both sent off to boarding school at a relatively young age. And for neither of us was that something that we look back on with a great deal of joy. It's not unambiguous. No, these things are never unambiguous, but it wasn't done with, it's not a great deal of joy. And also that the effect of boarding school on people is profound and complex. Mm-hmm. And we've been talking for about a year about developing some work to help serve people who, like us, went to boarding school, don't feel that, they necessarily need to go into a fully fledged therapeutic process about it, although, maybe, but who feel that they want a discussion around the topic. They want to be introduced to some of the research and understanding that there is about the effects of boarding school, particularly from this book, Boarding School Syndrome by Joy Shavarian. It's a very, very important book. Joy Shavarian is a psychoanalyst, I believe, who identified a series of common attributes among people who went to boarding school. And later in the next month, in December, Sorrel and I are going to run a 3-hour workshop where we really dig into this using some of Joy Shavarian's work and our own experiences. But for these two conversations, we wanted to explore the difference, as well as perhaps the similarities, but the differences between experiences of those who were sent off, to boys' school, the people like me, and those who were sent off to girls' school, like Sorrel. Because there are similarities, and there are also very definitely differences. In the British context, boys and girls' schools were always different, but girls' schools were modelled on boys' schools. Boys' schools came first, mainly because boys' schools set up when it still wasn't thought worthwhile educating women. And then when it did become worth educating women, the rich and the aristocracy wanted to educate women along the model that they had been educated. Boys had been educated, but they couldn't quite do it that way because women are different, of course. So you had a similar but different system. And that's what we're going to explore over these two sessions, tonight and next Tuesday. So I'm going to start, because this one is me really asking Sorrel to open up her experiences. So I'm going to start by inviting you to tell us where you want to start, Sorrel. Your experience. Tell us what our kicking off point should be.
Well, I think one of the really interesting things about people who went to boarding school is they have a degree of amnesia, either for their years before boarding school or for the years at boarding school. And mine is mostly for the years before boarding school. But I also have a very interesting memory of my very first day there. And I don't think it's not like a sort of video recording of what happened. I think it's kind of what my mind did with that experience, because the memory I have is and I was 11, and I don't think I was yet 5 foot tall. So I was, as a child, my parents had brought me. I imagine they took me upstairs and helped me unpack my suitcase, but I have no memory of that at all. But I remember my memories of standing in this big hallway with these polished wooden floors, with the front door at one end and the door to the day room at the other end. This is the house that I spent 7 years in, totally alone, which cannot have happened. There must have been other girls in that space. There were probably other girls like me, probably crying. And I have this sort of sense of wrenching loss that comes with that visual memory. And actually, I had some EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I had that well, probably about 8 or 10 years ago. I've kind of lost track of time. It must have been 10 years ago. And in part of that process is to take out the emotion from the memory so I can remember that now without it making me cry, which is
Mm.
quite nice because it's actually quite a powerful memory, but it doesn't have the sting anymore. And there's all sorts of random memories from my days at school, but I haven't got a nice clear narrative from the beginning to the end. And actually, as you probably know, John, my school is mentioned in Joy Shavarian's book because she used some writing by we had two headmistresses. The first one, Miss West, who was there until 1972. And she talks about
So does that was she there while you were there? Did
she
you?
was.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And so she talks about things in her memoir that I have no recollection of,
Mm.
which is interesting that you'd think that you'd remember the things that she talks about, but I don't. So
Just as an aside, Miss West, who is talked about as the headmistress of your school, is described as a relatively progressive, relatively compassionate example of a headmistress. And yet she tolerated the most, what from our perspective now, we look at it and go, that is a most appallingly abusive behavior. And yet she was relatively progressive and seemed to be someone who did actually care for children, unlike many of the teachers that I experienced and are written about in Joy's book. So what was your memory of her?
um I remember her as being quite scary. And actually the house that I lived in was next to her house. So there's a sense of like, oh, she's just next door, so you have to be extra careful because she can see through the walls. Well, obviously we didn't think that, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Quite strict. But interestingly, I cried a lot. I was incredibly homesick and I cried a lot. My mother talked to her, and my mother said that she was compassionate, and she said, "Yeah, I used to be like that as well." So that kind of humanized her a bit.
It's interesting, isn't it? And this is a recurring theme in boarding school research and people who talk about boarding school and teachers. I mean, I should say my father was a teacher at a boarding school, and my mother was at this boarding school I went to. He went home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and left me there. And my mother had met him when she was a nurse at the boarding school because she was a nurse. But it's a recurring theme. People going, what is happening is painful and unfair and wrong. And often people like Miss West saying, yeah, I was like that too. My father wasn't. He came from a working class background, so he was an outsider coming in. But many people had gone to boarding school and suffered, and yet
Yes.
they perpetuated the system.
Yes, indeed. And I have to admit, my parents had not been to boarding school. I was the first person in my family to go to boarding school. And there were reasons why all three, I've got two sisters, and all three of us went to boarding school. And it had to do with my father's mental health and some erroneous notions about how we would all end up with psychiatric problems if we stayed at home, which, as it turns out, we did anyway.
She all went to boarding school, got psychiatric problems there. You might as well pay for them rather than get them for
I
free.
mean, yeah, and without talking too much about my sister's experience, I mean, I've not had a psychiatric diagnosis, but I have been treated for depression by my GP. And I would link that back in part to the boarding school experience.
Could you just give us an overview of what that experience is? You said you went at 11. Was it a single school all the way through? Did you change school in that? What you say you don't have a coherent narrative, but what is the sort of the arc of the journey for you?
So it was 11 to 18. I spent all those 7 years in what was known as 8. So it's 8. There were 8 houses, and I was in number 8. And we had. So here my memory's a bit dodgy. There were 36 of us in the house, and there was a big dormitory where everyone in the first 3 years slept in that same dormitory. So that must have been 18 girls. But my memories of 12 or 14, which is kind of random. But memory is not very accurate.
Absolutely.
And then while I was there, something amazing happened. The upstairs dormitory, which was also for the same number of girls, got converted into what were called cubicles, which are like a two-bedder.
Mm-hmm.
So then you've got to share your cubie with somebody, and I think we could choose. I think there was a degree of choice about who we shared with. And the sixth form, it was a different arrangement. So sleeping was those first 3 years was hard because it's an enormous room with all these other girls. But I think the funny thing is that we kind of make up in our minds that things are not as bad as they really are.
That's an interesting thing, and I want to throw a quote at you from Joy Shivarian. I've
Um,
spent the last couple of days going back and rereading
yeah.
sections of her book. Um, she says, let me see if I can find the one I'm thinking of. Internalized, no, that's not what I'm looking for. Institutional abuse profoundly affects what the child expects of social relationships.
Mhm.
And she says, previously shocking behaviors,
Mm.
like suddenly find yourself thrown out from your family, separated from the home you love and being stuck in a room with 17 strangers. Previously shocking behaviors are considered normal.
Mm.
We come to normalize what is
Yeah.
in fact extremely abnormal. So that
Yeah.
idea that the abuse, if we want to call it abuse, it profoundly affects what we expect. We normalize what is essentially a shocking situation and go, well, this is just how it is.
Yeah.
What's the point of complaining about it? It's just how it is. So we actually come to believe that what is in essentially an abusive situation is in fact a normal situation.
And I think part of that process is that the older girls had already been through it.
Mm,
And so for them, they are part of that normalization process.
mm,
I don't know what it was like before, but when I arrived, there was a system whereby I think there was a girl 3 years older. So somebody from upstairs, as it were, in the upstairs dormitory, was allocated as a kind of, I can't think what she was called, a house mother or something. So
mm,
each of us new first years had this house mother who was 3 years older and was kind of charged with a bit of pastoral care for us. And I was lucky; I had someone who was really lovely.
mm.
Um, but nonetheless, all of those girls in the third and fourth and fifth year, which in those years were given weird names as well, but we'll just put the naming of years to one side because it's so Byzantine. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, and she was lovely, but I'm sure some of the girls didn't have that luck. And then just that notion of, yeah, well, that's how it works. That's what we did. And now we're up here and it's better.
But it's interesting that in this institution, which was meant to be dedicated to the care and education of children, not adults, children,
Children.
11-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 9 year. I mean, I went to boarding school when I was 8. So
Mm.
there were people there who'd been there since they were 5. These
Mm.
institutions that were dedicated ostensibly to the education of children, the caring role was given to another child.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
again, something that Joy Shivarian says, really interesting, that women, but in particular was relevant to girls' schools, women were taught to fulfill their anticipated social roles by subjugating their needs to the needs of others. And the internalized oppression arrived at not through overt bullying or overt brutality, which is what happened in boys' schools,
Mm.
but through a training in selflessness. That by the time you reached 14 or 15, George Shivarian is suggesting that you were being inculcated into this idea that your job was to be self-denying and selfless and caring for others, which all sounds very lovely, but of course it isn't when it's at the expense of your own growth as a person.
Absolutely.
Does that echo for
Yeah,
you or ring for
I,
you?
I think there was a sort of an underlying culture that, well, yeah, we were going. Actually, there was a whole kind of Church of England thing around service. I remember I hated that word
Yeah.
until about 5 years ago. I hated that word. I thought,
Yeah.
oh no, let's just start back at school again. So
Mm.
yeah, it was like you had to dedicate your life to service. And that could mean your husband or your parents or your community, it didn't matter what, but you never ever gave yourself any care or attention.
What was the price that you would have had to pay at school to try to assert your own needs?
Well, you would probably end up breaking the rules. And if you broke the rules, you'd get punished. And we didn't have beatings like girls' schools don't, generally speaking, engage in physical abuse.
Mm.
Some of the girls do, but the teachers don't. Um, but yeah, we'd have got punished, and the usual thing would have been lines.
Mm.
But there were some really random punishments. The one I remember is having to go around the school grounds and collect, I don't know, 50 or 100 pebbles from the grounds. And you brought them to whoever it was, probably your house mistress, but whoever. And there they were. And then the next day, I imagine a groundsman took them back and put them back on the grounds, ready for the
It,
next person. And then you had a punishment. Um, but then there was the other punishment was polishing tables. I quite
mm.
liked polishing tables, so I didn't mind that punishment. And I think the other thing about it is that you learned, I think Joy Shavarian talks about being conforming on the outside and rebelling on the inside.
Yes. Yeah.
I got quite good at working within what I knew I could get away with. So I was, on the surface, I was a right goody two shoes. I was rarely in trouble, but I pushed at the boundaries all the time.
Funny that thing that, and we're not really talking about my experiences in this one, but I remember I stayed an extra term at school because back in the day, if you were applying to Oxford or Cambridge, you
Yeah,
stayed and you did an extra term and then you did the the entrance exams. And
yeah.
I applied to get into Oxford. And I was a prefect and the head of house in that last
Mhm.
term. Fine. I mean, it was interesting. In some ways, everyone felt that I should have been a prefect the year before, but I was an awkward, rebellious, pain in the ass kid. And I was also, I had been bullied hugely during my time at school. And the masters didn't want to make somebody who was clearly weak and ineffective because he allowed himself to be bullied into a
Mhm.
role model for other boys by being a prefect. So I'd not been a prefect all the way through. But in that last term, I was head of house. And I remember there's one wee lad who was really unhappy. I mean, now I would look at it and go, he was clearly going through mental health crises. And he ran away at some point. There were big grounds in the school. It was an old hotel in North Wales. It was a big grounds, and he ran away into the woods. And I went to find him, and I found him smoking a cigarette, which immediately goes, I should report him and get him, blah 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 blah. And I remember sitting with him, and I didn't smoke, but I remember sitting with him and he said, "All right, you're going to report me?" And then I went, "No, I'm not."
Mm.
And he lit another cigarette. He'd stubbed it out when he saw me coming in. He lit another cigarette, and we sat there. And I tried to talk with him. And I remember really clearly just that moment of realization. This system, what I am meant to do in this system, is inhuman. It's
Mhm.
wrong. And if
Mm.
this means that I get expelled, which I probably well, at least demoted from whatever roles I had if I had been caught, then so be it. That for me, although
Mm.
George Trevelyan's talking about girls' schools as conformity on the outside and rebellion on the outside inside,
Inside.
it really,
You
really
know,
resonates.
what interests me about what you just told me, John, is that I can remember I was never a prefect. I
Mm,
was unconfident. I was shy. I wasn't very good at speaking for myself. Um, and I can remember thinking, oh, prefects, they're supposed to keep order and discipline,
mm,
but aren't they one of us? And realizing that you can move from being kind of like in the first 5 years, really, from 11 to 16, just one of the rank and file, if you like. And then in the sixth form, my God, when we got to sixth form, everything changed. Suddenly we were human beings. The teachers treated us with respect. They treated us almost as equals, which had never, it's like, a summer holiday had passed and suddenly we were a different species. It was bizarre. But those prefects, of course, were drawn from the sixth form, and so they kind of held dominion over the younger girls. And I always thought I think also I came from a very socialist family, so that would have given me a particular slant. But yeah, I saw it as kind of almost like class betrayal or something.
How strongly was hierarchy imposed in your school?
Well, that's another thing from reading the book, the Shavarian book, is it reminded me of things I'd forgotten. So she talks about the eating arrangements and how we sat. So we had these long tables with forms on either side, benches, and you sat in a particular order with girls of your own age. And as you went up the years, you moved up the table, but always with the same girls. And I'd forgotten that, but thinking about it, I can remember who I sat with. And at different stages, like in the fourth year, we did something called spud bashing, which basically on a Sunday morning, you went to the kitchens. Well, I think 2 or 3 girls went to the kitchens and removed all the black bits from the potatoes that had been peeled the night before. Because they didn't want to pay kitchen staff to peel the potatoes on Sunday morning, I guess. And it was something we hated. We hated spud bashing, and I think you probably got to do it once or twice a term. I can't remember. Once or twice a term. So you knew eventually it would be your turn and you'd have to do it. I don't remember whether we had to go up early or anything like that. And then there were just other duties. That was the word they used. There were duties. So that included things like polishing all the brass. There was a lot of brass in my school. Brass doorknobs, brass handles, brass plumbing fittings. And there was lots of brasso and lots of cloth.
And all of that designed to train you into domesticity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Into
And I don't imagine
obedience.
boys in boys' schools polish brass, do they?
No. the We'll talk about this on Tuesday. I find it a little difficult to talk about some of what happened. Well, some of it I find difficult to talk about just because it was pretty horrible. But I also find it quite difficult to talk about it because, as you mentioned at the beginning, amnesia is quite common. I've got very relatively sketchy memory of my entire school time. I don't remember my first day at school.
I think that's pretty common, actually, John, from people I've talked to.
I don't remember the prelude. I don't remember knowing that I was going to school, that I was going to be sent away to school, any of that stuff. So I don't really remember the details of expectations, punishments, all of that stuff.
Right.
I remember a certain sense. I mean, you talk about Church of England sense of service. My school, somebody else who has been there and who's done a lot of work exposing the culture of abuse that there was at my school, of sexual abuse that there was at my school. He describes it as a vile, colonial muscular Christianity. It was a Methodist school, be a man. And that hierarchy was really clear. I mean, you talk about the naming of the different years. Well, the lowest year in the senior school, because I went to the junior school, then the senior school, lowest year in the junior school was called the plebs, the plebeians. And the plebs could be ordered around by anyone else to do whatever anyone else wanted them to do.
Hey, we didn't have
pleb,
that.
come and do that. Come do that. Go get that for me. A very clear sense of social hierarchy all the time.
You'd have had fagging, wouldn't you?
We didn't actually have
we
didn't actually have institutional fagging, which is really just a posh name, an upper class name for bullying. We didn't actually have that. But there was a sort of expectation, particularly that a sixth former could simply demand that a junior boy went and did something for him. Go fetch me this, go tell so-and-so this, go find so-and-so and do
You know,
this.
what's really interesting, John, is that in my school, we had this kind of informal system which everyone adhered to, and I don't know how it originated. And a younger girl would crack on an older girl, which basically meant she thought she was nice and there was a bit of a crush going on. And then it was such a weird thing. We had a locker and we had a little basket for putting wash things in. So you'd go to the older girl's locker and you put her wash things in the wash basket, ready for her to, wash at the end of the day. This is around bedtime. And then she'd come and talk to you just before lights out and sort of tuck you in, as it were. And so that is that kind of reciprocal thing of like, I'm doing this service for you and you're doing this service for me.
Yeah.
And that was the closest we got to any sense of being cared for. There was absolutely no care in that school until I got to the sixth form, and then we had some new younger teachers. Actually, that's not true. We did have some younger teachers before then, but these new kind of teachers with families with their own children. After having had a whole cohort, which they were probably all in their 60s and were in process one after another of retiring. And the new teachers had a very different attitude to the girls, which really helped.
I'm aware of time, and we could talk on this for a lot, but for you looking back, and it's a few decades now that you're looking back over, and you've done some of the work or a significant amount of work in assimilating that journey and understanding it and so on. For you looking back, what do you think the biggest, I don't really like the word problems, but I'm going to use it as a shorthand, problems that you encountered in your post-school or adult life were that you can sort of trace back to that experience?
Yeah, I think actually that's quite easy.
Okay.
So it took me a while. The first thing was my dysfunctional levels of independence, which meant that I would just do things on my own. And in my marriage, I always found it really hard to go and talk to him about stuff. Partly because he was quite fond of the word no. Maybe he wouldn't have been so fond of the word no if I'd been, I don't know, anyway. So I had this independence. And actually probably I picked the three relationships that I had before, up until my divorce. I probably picked those men partly on the basis of what I was like. So there's the independence, there's the overwhelming need to be right. And those are two things that I've come across, and a lot of women I've interviewed about who've been to boarding school, about what they've recognized about themselves. And just like constantly relationships that don't work. So it's impacted really badly on all my relationships until I met Mark, who, as you know, is another boarding school survivor. We get each other, which really helps. But the other thing, which I realized much more recently, was how I split myself. And I think Joyce Shavarian talks about how you put yourself inside a shell. The way I saw it was, I quite like the internal family systems model, which is that I exiled my child self because I cried so much, and I got bullied because I cried, and I was humiliated, and I was so ashamed of it, and I felt like such a weakling. All I wanted to do was to grow up and not be a crybaby anymore. So I exiled that vulnerable child, and I only really realized that in the last year, or probably the last year actually.
The IFS system, internal family system approach, is really powerful for that. A few years ago, when I really finally felt I had to deal with some of this, it was actually through IFS therapy that I had my biggest insights. Very much a sense that there was in me that boy who I had tried to kill. I mean, literally tried to kill, go, you got me bullied, you bastard. And I exiled him is a nice way of putting it. I tried to cause him as much damage as possible so that I wouldn't be bullied anymore. The IFS model really helped me see that.
Yeah.
and go, there has to be a way to, reacquaint yourself with that child. The quote, there's a quote from Shivarian that speaks to what you're talking about, where she says, in the absence of a loving connection, the child may develop a defensive exterior.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we must always remember, that people talk of boarding school, oh, look, Harry Potter, oh, look, Bunter,
No.
or whatever, all of this stuff. And they're lovely stories and all of that stuff. But actually, and this is something that Nick Duffel writes about in his book, The Making of Them, I think it's called. Is it The Making of Them?
It is The Making of Them,
Yeah,
yeah.
The Making of Them, which is primarily about boys' schools. But he says that psychologically, there is very little difference between a child at the age of 8 being sent to an orphanage or a child at the age of 8 being sent to a boarding school, except that the child at the orphanage almost always knows that they weren't sent there voluntarily. Whereas a child at the boarding school thinks, this is what my parents wanted for me.
Yeah.
And we are sent to a place where there is no love.
Yeah.
Unless it is a very dangerous love, which it was at times in the school I went to.
Yeah.
Which is not a love at all. It's
It's not love. You're
no,
right.
it's not remotely love. I shouldn't even say that, but it pretends to be love and care, but is in fact simply abuse.
Yeah.
So that thing, in the absence of those loving connections, we just go,
Well, we make it like we don't need it.
yeah, absolutely. We convince
Yeah.
ourselves we don't need it.
Although I don't think I'd say that I didn't believe I needed it, but I just was no good at being in a loving relationship.
Mm.
And actually, the thing for me, John, that kind of overshadowed boarding school was that I had that really traumatic bereavement when I was 20.
Mhm.
And so I could not tell you what the impact of boarding school was on my 20s because I was dealing with that bereavement.
Sure.
And so I only started to become more aware of it as I got older. You kind of unpeel one layer and you get to the next layer down, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think you make a really important point there, that this may be just the way I see things, but I'm very suspicious at saying I am like this because of that.
Oh, I don't say that. I
Yeah,
say I'm like this because I created myself this way to cope with that.
yeah, good, yes, but also, and I know we've talked about this during our private conversations before. I experienced what I experienced at boarding school because of who I was before I went to boarding school.
Yes.
I experienced who I was. I was who I was before I went to boarding school because of what my parents experienced when they were growing up. And so it's all boarding school isn't necessarily always the cause of
Not
it.
the only thing.
It's not the only thing. So
Yeah.
yes, you peel back and peel back.
You
But
know
what
what?
we,
I have three sisters, like I said. My
uh,
two younger sisters went to a Quaker school because by the time my middle sister was old enough, my parents were earning too much money for them to go to my school because it was a charitable institution. They had different experiences from me
mm,
and different from each other. And we're all different people and we brought different characters
mm,
into boarding school. And that obviously shapes the way we experience it and
yeah,
the kind of adaptations that we create to cope with it.
yeah. It's interesting. It is though important. I think the distinction you make is really important. To survive, both when we were at boarding school and in the decades since, we have created ways of being in the world which were entirely necessary because they enabled us to survive.
And yeah,
They may not be efficient or effective, and they may certainly be things we want to stop doing now. I mean, I've just
totally.
said,
Yeah.
but it's not that we were stupid or we couldn't cope or whatever. It's that being the person I was in school, facing the things I faced, I made choices that I needed to do to get myself through from beginning of term to the
And a
end of
lot
term.
of those choices were not conscious, were they?
Absolutely not.
So,
Absolutely not. In fact, I didn't see till decades later
no,
the choices
absolutely.
that I'd made.
I didn't know what I was doing. And I still have to bite my lip. The whole thing about needing to be right, I still have to bite my lip. But I know that I'm biting my lip for a good reason, which is that See, it's just not very relational to be constantly criticizing what your partner is saying.
But in our
The
conversations,
whole,
you are always right, Sorrel, so it's fine.
John, how could you possibly say that?
So I want to wrap this
Yeah,
because
I'm just getting on.
it's time's getting on. There's a couple of people in the room who may want to question or comment or reflect. If you do, please unmute and do so. If not, then you don't need to. But if you do want to reflect or question anything, then we will happily respond.
Oh.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating because it's kind of boarding school is a very big, in my mind, a UK thing. Like a lot of my UK friends have gone to boarding school and some of them have thrived. You know, there's just they've got this huge personality that maybe enabled the thriving, you know, and like you both said, it's not really what boarding school did to you. There's so many other factors that go into that. But I find like that book you keep referencing, I think I have to read it. It's so fascinating. Yes, boarding school syndrome.
Yeah.
So thank
Psychological
you so
trauma.
much for your stories.
But Joy Shivarian is the therapist who really did the work to bring together a whole range of things. She's actually didn't go to boarding school, but she kept getting clients coming in and seeing links between them. And she brought together the whole thing where she said, I think we can identify what she calls boarding school syndrome, a suite of behaviors, and we can trace the things that are reported to have happened in boarding school which might underlie those behaviors. And then there's other books like Nick Duffel's The Making of Them and so on, which are less psychologically research based, but are still really powerful in helping us understand, you know, the culture, the history, and the effects of boarding school. And frankly, certainly in Britain, and I suspect the same is true in Canada where you are, looking at those books helps explain the behavior of a huge number of leaders in our societies. It certainly does in Britain. I think it does, you know, you look at the entitled, emotionally dead people who are leading so many Western nations, and you trace them back and you go, I can see hints of this stuff. I mean, I'm extrapolating because I don't know, but certainly the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a perfect example of an entitled boarding school boy who is dead inside. You know, I might just have committed slander.
I was just wondering that, John.
But you know what?
I think it lets him off.
Yeah,
I think it lets him off the hook a little easily, actually.
Actually, as Perry
it
would
does.
say, the poor perpetrator. You poor perpetrator.
Yeah.
The reason you're behaving so appallingly is because of the awful experience you had as a child.
Yeah.
So if I don't know if you guys know, but you know, boarding school is still a thing in the UK.
Oh,
So
yeah.
are there more checks and balances in terms of abuse? And you know in Canada we've got a different meaning behind residential schools because they were targeted at a certain demographic, a certain culture for not a good reason. So that's really our big experience with residential schools. And I'm really curious of the crossover. But since you guys are still big into boarding schools, has that whole setup, is there a bit more checks and balances for a healthy environment?
But my understanding is that a significant amount has been done to recognize the problems of the old boarding school system. You know, there is the possibility of a child to report abuse and be believed. There is when I was at boarding school, you're forbidden to have any contact with your parents for the first 3 weeks of every term. It was thought to be good with you. No, no letters, no nothing. So, all of that stuff is ameliorated, but the child is still being excluded from their home at a time when it is not right for them to be excluded from their home, and they are still being sent to a place where care and love, which is the foundation for a healthy upbringing, is institutionalized. It's contractual. And you are still in a place where there is a possibility for scared children ganging up together to bully other scared children. So the core function, the core fact of a boarding school is the removal of children from their families. And doesn't matter whether you let them have teddy bears these days, which you certainly didn't when I was at boarding school. That core fact doesn't change. And Joy Chavarin's actually really interesting, where she says one of the only groups of people she sees who really thrived through boarding school was those who came from chaotic, dysfunctional, or dangerous families, where the boarding school was actually a blessed relief from what they were leaving, because they encountered more stability and love in the boarding school than they had in their home families. But for everyone else, it's a degrading of the childhood experience. So my own opinion is that you put all the bells and whistles you want on it, it's still ripping a child out from their family.
Yeah, it is. I think it's true that there are some children whose families are so highly dysfunctional that boarding school is a better place for them. But it's a structural problem. You are ripping the child away from their family. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So there are changes, but whether they are ever going to make it possible for the institution to be worth preserving is another matter, I think. And as you say, I know a little bit of the situation in Canada, and it is, of course, a very different situation, but there are also very clearly parallels that can be drawn, I think. So shall we hold that there? And it is a holding because...
Can I end with something a bit more positive, John?
Yeah, please do.
Can I just say that, if anyone out there is watching this and is thinking, oh, yeah, this is terrible, and I don't know what I can possibly do about it, even maybe their spouse is a boarding school survivor, yeah, change is possible, because we change throughout our lives. My dad learned not to be anxious when he was 94. If my dad could change at the age of 94, we can all change at any stage in our lives.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is big reason for hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is worth saying that. And, for me, it's really only in the last 5, 6, 7 years that I've looked squarely at that experience, and the internal changes and the sense of empowerment that's come. For me, it means writing about it, because I process things through writing and so on. It's been transformational.
It's transformational, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's worth, I think, identifying. One of the things that this is so important, Nick Duffel talks about it. A lot of people who went to boarding school don't want to acknowledge that they suffered or struggled, because you're meant to be privileged. You meant, what, you're complaining about having a better education than everyone else, all of that stuff. Acknowledging that being excluded from your family at a young age was not a privilege you wanted is a starting point for change. But you're so right, Sorrel. It's not the ending point.
No,
it's
it's
just
not.
You go, this is what happened, and now I get to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is partly what we'll be looking at in detail in the workshop we'll run together in December for School of Humankind. But yes, we're going to suspend this conversation because we carry it on Tuesday, when roles are reversed and you take me through the ringer.
I'm going to give you the right old grilling, John.
I don't know if that was hard for you or not, Sorrel, and you don't have to say.
No,
but
the only hard thing is that you just don't stop talking. But I'm used to that.
Who, me? I have no idea what you're talking about.
I can see people laughing.
Yeah, right. It's only because they're vindictive and malicious, like everybody in my life. So we'll come back again same time on Tuesday, and I'm going to shut up and let Sorrel say goodbye.
Wow, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from him.